So again, just welcome. Very pleased to be here as part of this event, and very much appreciate the World Women Foundation inviting us to be part of this event and moderating this session on women leading the way on a just and equitable energy transition. My name is Tracey Crowe. I'm the Chief of Staff and Senior Director for Sustainable Energy for All. We have a fabulous panel with us here today. So let me introduce them, and then I'll just frame the discussion a little bit first as well. So please welcome Tish Mendoza, and you are the Senior Vice President and the Chief Human Resources Officer for AES Corporation, right?
Right, that's right.
Very much welcome you being part of this. Eduarda Zoghbi, political scientist. I'm not sure I need it, but I'll use it. Political scientist and director of the Women in Energy Brazil program from Columbia University. So, yes. Okay. All right. And then I'll introduce our third panelist when he gets here. So what I wanted to do is before we get into the questions, is really just start by framing this discussion a little bit and talk about, the title is A Just and Equitable Energy Transition. So I think everybody knows that we are in the midst of a climate crisis. There is a news report, multiple news reports every single day. So we know that happens. Energy that accounts for about 3/4 of the emissions that are contributing to climate change. So the climate crisis is also an energy crisis. You cannot separate those two. So it's imperative that we transition our energy systems, our global energy systems, to clean and low carbon so that we can address the climate crisis. But the other component of this is what's going on with energy poverty. So we have 733 million people around the world who do not have any electricity, none. We've got 2.4 billion people who do not have access to clean cooking. So you cannot separate these what I describe as three challenges: climate crisis, energy crisis, and development crisis. We have to put those three together. Energy, climate, and development have to go together. We cannot address the climate crisis and leave people behind. We cannot leave those billions of people behind. So we have to address energy access. We have to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 7, which is access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all by 2030, as critical to the path to net zero emissions by mid-century, by 2050. So we want to put all of these together, and that's what we mean at Seforall when we talk about a just and equitable energy transition. It is putting together the energy, climate, and development components and making sure no one is left behind. So that's the framing that we have to get us going into this conversation. Now I want to bring you all into this. And I'm going to start with just an icebreaker question. So what do you think a just and equitable energy transition should mean for women?
Me first?
I'll start with
So first of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for allowing me to have the opportunity to speak with all of you about this very important topic. We completely share your sentiment in that you cannot separate those two things. And I was reflecting on this talk and then reflecting on the topic, and I think it was in late 2018 or 2019, certainly before the pandemic, actually having this exact discussion, which is how do we help women participate in the energy transition? How do we help them participate in the sector? And when I look back and think about where we are today, the impact of the pandemic, particularly on women, and then the climate crisis and the acceleration that we need to see in renewables. Unfortunately, I don't think that we can make incremental changes at this point. I think that this is the moment that we need to seize and that we need to accelerate the participation of women in the sector. And so this is very near and dear to our heart at AES. We are a purpose-driven company. Our purpose is to improve lives, to accelerate the future of energy together. And together is very meaningful in that we need to do that with all of our stakeholders, and in particular, it starts in our communities. And so, you know, we are very much on our transition. We have made a commitment, maybe you've seen, I hope you've seen, that we are exiting coal and heavy fuel oil by the end of 2025. And we're developing over 5 gigawatts of renewables on a year-over-year basis. And so we've seen that this opens up a lot of opportunity for women, but what we found is that there are barriers to entry. And in certain countries, it's actually even more difficult. And so what we have to do is be intentional and program around creating those opportunities. And we start in the communities, and it goes all the way through the organization. And then even after individuals leave the organization, there's a connection and affinity to the work that we do. So it's very purposeful. We feel it in our heart. Our value, our purposes has the word together in it. We have a core value of all together, and it means all of those things.
Great. Eduarda?
Sure. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and especially talking about what a just energy transition means. I think it's important maybe to give you context of who I am. I'm from Brazil, so I speak a lot from a global south perspective, and as someone who has been a youth activist since I was 12. So I was, you know, one of the most important COPs, and I'll explain why this is important, what I'm going to say, was the COP in Copenhagen in 2009. And at that time I was in Denmark for a year. And I remember I went to the streets protesting, I think one of the first times I ever did that for climate justice, back in the day where young people were not allowed in the rooms and we did not have a chance to be heard. A lot has changed, but I think that the COP processes, and now we're this week, you know, in Climate Week, very important for us to understand that when everything started in 1992 in the Earth Summit in Rio, where the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, was created, it was very clear that we had something called common but differentiated responsibilities, which means that when we talk about climate change, when we talk about energy justice, we have to account for the fact that industrialized nations and most global north nations have been emitting greenhouse gases for the past 300 years, whereas now countries in the global south that are developing are starting to increase their emissions. So I think that when we talk about, you know, responsibility, we talk a lot about how the global north can provide global south countries with technology, with finance and support. And I think this type of support comes a lot with gender equality and thinking from a bottom-up approach. And again, this is incredibly important because I was just reading a study that just came out in Brazil about, you know, climate justice matters for whom. So who are these people that need climate justice? And it's usually something that comes from a very theoretical standpoint. Most of the people that have written about climate or energy justice come from the US or from European countries. And it's very important to understand from the people that need it the most, what is it that they need? And I think when it comes to a just energy transition, as Tracey mentioned, it's an energy crisis. And the people who are suffering from lack of energy access are usually the ones who are not heard on what they need. Lastly, I'll just give an example because in the previous panel about AI, I love the example with the sensors for whoever was here before. One example I have is I spent some time in Kenya in a community in the countryside, and I remember that there was this beautiful, pristine kitchen that was made through bilateral cooperation with Kenya, and no one in the community used that kitchen, ever. And why is that? Because nobody really, you know, taught the women there how to use that kitchen, or why is it better for their health to be using clean cooking fuels. So I think that a lot of it has to come with technical assistance, have to come with support, and with empathy, especially for us women who are dealing with other women. We have to put ourselves in their shoes and how hard it is to, you know, not be able to go work outside of your home because, you know, culturally speaking, you're not allowed to in many countries yet. So I think that all of that has to do with what we want to see in a just energy transition.
Thank you. Thank you both. Mark, welcome. Mark Carrato, coordinator of Power Africa. We're very glad that you were able to join us. So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit.
All right.
So but I know you're ready for this because you're always ready for our questions. So we did the framing of what is a just and equitable energy transition, but framing it now around women. So just as an icebreaker question, what does a just and equitable energy transition mean or should mean for women?
Thank you, Tracey. Good to see you. Apologies for being late. It wasn't for lack of trying, I swear. I left my DC home before 6 this morning, got to New York, thought, I know New York traffic. I was here a couple weekends ago. And it took me about 45 to 50 minutes to get from the Upper East Side. Like, there's no streets open. So super apologize. I came from being 20 minutes early to being 20 minutes late. One Uber ride, but I won't bore you with that. No, it's great to be here, and I really appreciate the question. And it's something that's really near and dear to Power Africa's mandate and thesis. And if you know our new administrator, USAID, Samantha Power, and you know our new strategies, and you know Power Africa since its genesis nearly 10 years ago with President Obama, it's always been what we try to do. It's not easy work. It's personal as well for me, being a son, being a father of a daughter. I studied a little bit of gender a lot in grad school, and just the idea of how do we look at the differences of people and how does that differences, whatever they may be, help us get inclusivity. So obviously the question here is, and framing it around on women, for us it's 2 parts. It's exactly what we try to do and how we try to get it done. So on the first one is access, and I think I heard some of your comments, Lillian, fantastic, couldn't agree more. And in fact, if I say things that have been said, just start nodding your head like this is uncovered. Because I don't have the luxury of knowing. But obviously access, who uses power and how they use power, and how you, and then on the other side, who makes the decisions. And to some extent, they all should look like me. And unfortunately, 80% of the people in the energy sector do look some semblance of me, at least in terms of gender. So we have to change that. We have to figure out a way to change those processes. We do a lot with Power Africa internally. I have a fantastic colleague here who I told her to come take the stage and I was going to be late because she's dynamic and fantastic. But we try to do it in terms of who we use in terms of Power Africa to make decisions. We do it in the way we do trainings, and we do it in the way we approach governments, we hope, both across the board. We at Power Africa, and if you don't know a whole lot about Power Africa, I'm happy to talk to anybody afterwards. It's a fantastic initiative that again, I mentioned President Obama started nearly 10 years ago. But we try to hit the whole continuum of what it needs to get energy access. So top line goals are 350 million people or 60 million connections in Africa and 30,000 megawatts. And so we are an enabler. We're a large partnership, 200 plus organizations, 12 US government agencies, including mine, USAID, who holds the coordination role, but Department of State, Department of Energy, Millennium Challenge Corporation, US DFC, USTDA, et cetera. And together with those and 20 development partners like World Bank, and then 170 plus companies who have signed up with some level of specificity to get toward those same goals, we try to get the job done for power. But we know we're not going to get it done if we're not allowed to make sure we look at it holistically, right? So on the one side, I think I'll just jump off a little bit. I think renewable energy allows us now to change the script, right? The fossil-based economy and the way we've been doing power, even the way we've been building out powers, even the idea of the grid, I think need to change, and especially in Africa. And I don't think it's hopefully a throwaway comment of, oh, Africa can leapfrog, which I think is true on some level, but not in the throwaway way. I think it's true in the sense that you see an opportunity, you see it coming, you see where the finance is going, and we start doing the job on my side of making sure a developed country like the US and our partners can start making those connections. We'll change the way it's done. And as we change that, we need to make sure it's equitable and inclusive as we get there, right? So how do we make sure women's voices are being heard? Some ways we do that are in policy and program. One big thing Power Africa did, like a lot of other folks, when the pandemic hit, about 2 weeks after the pandemic hit, I started Power Africa. And we had our little stress test about could the US government function if we go home and not have to telework. And we just never came back. And so a few years later now, we're starting to figure this out. But we, like everyone else, said, well, what changed? Obviously a lot of things changed. We're home. But how's that change the way we do business? And what do we think about it? Do we target the right things? And one place we landed on, which is kind of obvious, but if you really kind of peel back the onion, not totally obvious, because it's not necessarily going to be an immediate COVID response, is health facility electrification. And health facility electrification has massive gender inequality baked into it, right? Because of the way women access healthcare. So we said this is one way we can get a couple things we want to get done at the same time. So we, with Seforall and their great leadership, have a global compact under the UN Genesis of this compacts to get people crowded in. And then we on the Power side ourselves are about ready to launch a very large public-private partnership to go up to 10,000 clinics. And so by electrifying these clinics, we make a lot of that, antenatal and prenatal care, a lot of routine immunizations, not even delivering babies in the dark, all kinds of things that disproportionately affect the way women access healthcare, hopefully better, right? So that's an access point. Another one might be we support through rooftop solar in Nigeria, gender-based violence response centers. So again, just more of a typical solution, but making sure we're doing it in places where we get double bang for a buck. There's about, you could throw a dart at the wall and hit a really good place to work with renewable energy. Why not make it a place that also has double bang for the buck, as it were? And then we do a lot of stuff like when we look at agriculture. Like everyone else, we're interested in productive use of power, not just access to power, but how people use it. So how do women might use it differently? Or more importantly, in the case of agriculture, how are the norms currently going, and are we going to make sure we don't reinforce those norms? So on solar pumps, we put out a whole gender-informed marketing guide. So we made sure that women farmers also would have access to the information and the ability to use in a different way. Just 3 examples, but PowerFit tries to, at every level, make sure we're thinking about how we look at that. Really briefly, if I could, Tracey. On the other side is participation. And I mentioned before that 8% of the energy sector, more or less, according to the UN, is male-dominated, right? So that obviously is not in line with population numbers by any stretch, right? So what do we do to try to make sure we make those renewable change now also be a leapfrog for a place to have renewable transition for people who get to make the decisions, get to craft the programs and so forth on the policy side? So I don't know if you know, but according to the numbers we've been looking at, that women are about 32%, still not great, of the workforce when it comes to renewables versus 22% in oil and gas. So again, already, I would have, looking at my own 9-year-old daughter, I would say, who's always on me for making sure I'm walking a greener path. I think people see the opportunity. I think smart young women out there and entrepreneurial women are saying, well, this is the place where there is going to be long-term investment. I'm going to get in this spot. So I think a little bit's happening by people self-selecting, and smartly so, but we have to keep fostering, doing a lot more of that. So it's going to take more than us saying it's just equitable position, though we will keep saying that, and advocacy is important, of course. But again, a couple of examples of things we try to do to change that. I was in Kigali about 6-7 months ago now, and we have this fantastic thing called the Power Her Network. If you ever want to be uplifted and figure out a way of changing lives, we have a very enterprising officer there, Claire, who said she saw a need of trying to figure out a way to institutionalize change, and starting with more of the junior ranks in the Rwandan utility and some of the Rwandan energy companies, getting women into positions of power, which then now, years on, is, as you would expect, not surprisingly, is dominoing up. And now women are in higher positions of power. And all of a sudden, this network, which is, you go in there and you can see the mutual support going on in this room, from now the senior folks who start as the junior folks to the junior folks, and then giving each other opportunities, right? Not unfairly, but saying, yeah, of course you're going to get an interview, or of course we'll figure out a way, or do you want to prep? This is going to be a situation you're not familiar with. So that's an example of I think, of training workforce. Another one is our Nigeria Energy Sector Women's Leadership Initiative. We've trained 1,400 women since 2020. So again, in this example, a bit more of a very directed training program, in the sense of, let's get the right methodology, let's get it out there, let's make sure people have access. And then the last one I would say is, we talked about and I'll stop here, energy transition. So we have a fairly notable commitment to South Africa, we the US government, with Germany, the UK, EU, and France, to the tune of $8.5 billion commitment, made it COP26 when South Africa committed to take off 20 to 25 gigawatts of coal. So massive idea in terms of what we had to get done out of the gate. And this is an example we want to make work. So again, not only are all the standard challenges there, as common as utility, South Africa is in pretty bad shape in terms of its debt profile. You need about probably 70 gigabytes of renewable energy to make up for 22 gigabytes. You have entire provinces like in Mpumalanga, where there's coal miners whose entire livelihoods have been made on the back of the coal economy. a lot of things to get through. But in addition, some of the stuff we're doing in terms of the knowledge of doing specific design strategies with people and women in the sector, saying, how do you get involved in this, in any one of those areas of the problem? Renewable energy build out, the transition to coal miners, working with municipalities in South Africa, which, if you know, energy is quite a new idea. It's not a sovereign federal level, it's taking it down, which also brings people of all differences closer to decision making, right? But we had to have a concerted effort to make sure that within our JET, as we kick off all this money together, that we make sure women have an avenue to access it just as easy as anyone else. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mark. And I think what you were talking about leads very well into my next question for Tish, and that's the opportunities. What should be, what could be the opportunities for women? We're 32% in the workforce. That needs to be at least 50%. How do we get more women in the workforce? What are the opportunities? And both at the technical level, as installers and designers and engineers, on up through to decision making. And I think from your perspective at AES, I'm sure you have quite a bit to talk about.
So I echo a lot of what the comments that you made, and I was nodding a lot. I don't know if you could see my head next to you nodding.
Because I said before? Because it was already said, or because?
No, because I remember having the same conversation. So as I said in my opening remarks, we're very intentional in terms of the work that we do, and we see it the same way. So we sort of think about the value chain all the way from like the communities in which we operate all the way through, So we've designed programs that that we can have influence and have impact. And so one of our strategic pillars is that if we're in a market, then we need to have critical mass, and we need to be connected to that market, and we need to be able to have an impact. And so it starts very early, and what we do is we find opportunities to educate. I think you were talking about the cooking. And so if we find that there's education that we need to provide, we do that at the community level. And then we look at how do we create economic opportunities for the folks that are local, but in particular we really program around women. And so there are initiatives where, like in Brazil, we were building a wind farm, and we very specifically targeted the local community, trained them, and it was actually targeted at women. So that site is run 100% by women. We have the same sort of initiatives in Columbia, where we really wanted to make a difference in terms of bringing women into the workforce. And so we created training programs, and we have women who are now operating the hydroelectric plant in Columbia. And then that is at all levels. So it's one thing to get them in, and then it's another for them to be stagnant. And so we have to create programming inside that gives them visibility and then gives them pathways to leadership levels. And that program in Columbia was so successful that when we were building a solar farm, we did the same thing. We targeted women, and so now we have women who were engineers and who worked in the construction, which it's unheard of in the industry. And I could go on and on and on about programs that are just like that. And so we really look at how do we create that pipeline, and we start even at early education, at college. How do we create the pipeline for people to come into the organization or not? We work with entrepreneurs as well. But specifically, how do we do that in a way that gives women equal voice? And then once you're in the organization, we create pathways for development. And so again, you have to be extremely intentional. And I think once you have success, then you just keep going. And so that was the other thing that we learned from our market. So the program that we have, I should talk about the program in El Salvador. We have brought, again, it's actually was not intended to be a pipeline of talent for our company. It was really more about community development and engagement. We've trained over 500 women to be electricians. And that program has been so impactful and so meaningful. We're now looking at, okay, how do we scale that in the US? And so those types of programs we learn. So if there's a willingness, we learn how to do it, and then we replicate. And so we think that that's our contribution, to be in the communities, to make a positive impact, and where we have found success, then it's our job to replicate that across our portfolio.
Great. And then the other aspect of this, and I think you've touched on it a little bit, and as my boss always wants to emphasize, we want more women in the workforce, in the energy sector, but we also want them in government as policymakers, because if you don't have them at that level, you're just missing that perspective that is so crucial to making those decisions that impact the millions of billions of lives. Eduarda, I know you've actually worked with governments in trying to influence governments. So maybe even bringing a little bit of that perspective in, but and you've already touched on it some as well on the developing country perspective. But what opportunities could or should be available in Brazil and other developing countries, and in government as well?
That is a great question. First, one thing that I think both panelists mentioned a lot was opportunity. And I just wanted to maybe touch on the intersectionality factor, that opportunity most of the time and in most developing countries is not something that is available for everyone. And I say this because this varies according to your class, your income, your gender, your race, everything. And in Brazil, I was talking these past few days with some friends that have grown up in favelas, so in slums and the outskirts of cities, who told me, well, I've been taught since I was little that I was not going to work out, that I was going to get into violence and I'm going to be eventually arrested. So some children and some adolescents are growing up with this narrative that they will be part of the system in this way. So I think that a lot of these interventions, and I'm glad that you mentioned communities, have to go to these areas, because at the end of the day, I consider myself very privileged to be able to, study abroad, to, be here today, even speaking here, because most of my friends that even studied with me have gone in different ways. And one key thing, I think, for opening more space for women, not only in the energy sector, but in all their male-dominated sectors, is also retention. So one of the key steps, I think, is access to education. So obviously all women have the right to be in schools and not be working. And after that, even if they're interested in the energy sector and the doors have been open for them, it's very hard to remain in a sector where you never see role models and you never see people like yourself, even in terms of race and ethnicity, occupying positions of power. So I think that creating these spaces with the private sector is very important. And I think the private sector has been doing a better job at that now that we have ESG targets and all of that. But then back to your question about governments, it's extremely hard because, so according to UN Women, Brazil ranks 142 out of 190 countries in terms of representation in the parliament. So we have about 15% of women in a country that voting is mandatory. So I think that there's also a lot of responsibility as, for us women to be voting and voting for other women, not just because they're women, but also for what they're proposing. And, whoever is in a more senior level position in organizations, grabbing these girls and trusting them with the power of sharing their knowledge and, being a role model for other younger women. And I'm only here today, again, because I have a lot of role models, including Daniela, including yourself. So I think that, seeing women that have gone there in their careers is something extremely inspiring. Now, in terms of opportunity for government, you have to require governments to do better in terms of having more women in governments, not only in the legislative branch, but also in the executive branch, because this is possible. By mainstreaming gender in projects, you can require women to be part of projects, and then the government has to find a way to do that, because otherwise they're not going to be compliant to the project. So I think that there are small ways of finding, mainstreaming gender and also providing opportunities for women to speak at events, to have visibility in the sector, because most of the time they are doing most of the work, but they're not being seen. So I think that's also an important component.
So shifting gears just a little bit. So Seforall held its forum, its global forum in Kigali in May. And one of the key outcomes of that was what we call the Kigali Communique. And this came out of a meeting of energy ministers from Africa. So we created the space, and then they actually tried to define what does a just and equitable energy transition mean for Africa? What does it mean for developing countries? And they came up with principles, but those need to be developed out further. And they need to include women, and how do we make sure women are benefiting from and decision makers and part of that just and equitable energy transition. So Mark, if we had to define principles, further define those principles for a just and equitable energy transition that really addressed women, what would they be? Is there one more principle? Are there 5 principles? But what are the principles that should be included in defining that just and equitable energy transition for women?
Well, I would note that hopefully we don't ask a middle-aged white guy to take the mic on that one all the time, in the sense of, I think this is part of the issue, right? I mean, this is always a very hard topic. Whenever I speak on gender or women or, any kind of topic on inclusivity, you always got to check back from your own baggage, right? And see who you are, where you come from, and you got to own it, right? So the way I look at it is, and this is a bit of a personal approach to answering your question, is that everyone's got their turn in the saddle doing different things at different times in their lives, right? You just got to do the best you can while you're there. And I hope that I can make my daughter proud. Hope I can make my own team proud. In terms of actually giving recognition too, I do want to note very specifically, Claudia over here, please raise your hand, who is the brains behind a lot of our participation in UNGA this week, right? So we do have a team. The team matters. Sometimes I'm up there at the front, but I do think it's important to recognize so forth. I also think, on a very personal note, talk about role models. I quickly noted, as we do when we're listening to people talk, think about your own experience. I'm like, God, 3 or 4 of my best role models at 8 are women as well. And why is that different? Or what does that mean to me? Well, if I had to pick 5 people at 8 who I consider USAID, where I've been for nearly 20 years, who are the titans, 2 of them, in fact, one I think I saw on the train this morning, but couldn't catch her in time, are women. And so it's a non-gender thing. So I see role modeling women as well. And I think that's also part of this process of change, because it's personal decisions that lead to programmatic policies, where you're getting to, that will change how we look at this stuff over time. And quite frankly, those policies give us guidelines, but no guarantee to institutionalize the change we all believe needs to happen, that over time hopefully will manifest in better numbers, over 32%, so on and so forth. So a couple I think are fairly obvious, I hope, and I think are making headway in some spots more than others. I take your point totally, that some of the contexts we work in are hard. They're really hard to make institutional change, and you are bucking, in some respect, at least a political norm, if not even deeper norms in society, which is a tough, thorny issue to doubt. But equal pay, obviously, right? So when we talk about we flesh that out, it's got equal pay for equal work, even an equal opportunity to get equal pay for equal work. Sexual harassment policies, huge. You gotta feel safe wherever you're at. So if, especially in societies, including our own, where far too long that's been a norm, or one that wasn't really addressed, or maybe a slap on the wrist, we gotta make sure people understand that's behavior that just can't happen. And that will give people like the trust and the faith to be in those workplaces better. Parental and flexible leave, and parental flexible leave for work schedules. I think that's great for guys as well. I wish back when I had my children, the U.S. government had the policies they had today. It's still not awesome compared to the rest of the world, but better. But for women in particular, my wife had to exhaust all of her leave. We're both foreign service officers in the U.S. Agency for National Development, and I still have a ton of leave because of the way I could do it, and the way she had to because of giving birth and everything else. She had to go for years building back her leave. Totally unfair, right? It's in my own family, I can see it, right? So we have to have policies that work that way as well. Adopting talent leadership programs and approaches that I think foster different kinds of leaders and value different kinds of leaders. Again, I'll get a little personal here. When you look, if you can speak fast and be aggressive and be confident, that sells in a lot of spots. Other people have different leadership styles. There's not one that's necessarily better than the other, maybe different for different times. We all need to dial on something we're not good at. So times mine is to not be that confident, fast talking, guy in the background, and make sure I listen more. Other times, though, we got to make sure we value people who lead in different ways. And if there's gender dimensions to that, then let's understand those and try and tackle that. And then, and then this one's going back down to a very logistical, but to your point of construction, gender appropriate uniforms. You have entire industries that have safety gear and uniforms and everything else that are been geared for guys to do the work forever. Something like that is going to stop someone, maybe, or definitely make it harder for them to continue to climb and go forward. So it goes from the big grandiose all the way down to the real practical. I would just say those are a couple as examples I'd give.
All right, I know we want to leave a little bit of time for questions, but before we open it up for questions, I just want to ask additional thoughts. What haven't I asked? What are the thoughts that you want to make sure you get out there before we open it up to other questions? Let's start with
you. I think maybe one thing that we haven't emphasized as much, and I think that here we have a very diverse audience that maybe it's, and I was just talking over lunch with someone I met about this component, which is clean cooking. I think that for most people who are not in the energy industry, it's important to acknowledge that at this moment we have a lot of women, I think it's 2 billion, that's the number, right? Of women, with 2 or 3 billion women without access to clean cooking fuels. And this may seem like it's something very small, but it mostly affects countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. And these are women that are spending about 4 hours of their day cooking or looking for other fuels, biomass in the nature, such as firewood and charcoal to cook, and compromising their own health because they're being exposed to fumes every day. And I was just saying as well to my friend, who's somewhere there, that it's interesting because she works with health, and we forget that when we talk about gender equality, we're not just talking about reducing poverty, but also improving health, improving access to education. And by improving clean cooking, you're giving girls and women more time for income generation activities, and also having time to study, to go to school. Whereas a lot of boys and men, they don't have to do that for cultural reasons, and they go off to school, whereas the girls, they stay back home to help their moms with domestic responsibilities and cooking and fetching fuels. So I think that, and then we go back to the discussion of finance. It's incredible the amount of finance that is out there for renewable energy, for a lot of different projects, but so little for clean cooking, and how much we don't discuss this, how much I see that this is not on the table whatsoever, and not even thinking, also thinking of how gender can be cross-cutting in other sectors. So Seforall has a great report on cooling needs that I was part of, that we discussed how women can benefit from cooling, from appliances, because if you go to a textile industry in Bangladesh, women are working 12 hours a day without air conditioning, and then they're fainting, and they have health issues because they don't have access to cooling. And I wrote about also in Brazil, we have a lot of women who are still doing a lot of domestic work, being very underpaid, and coming from favelas, spending about 4 hours commuting per day in buses without air conditioning. So when we think about energy and how to provide energy in a just and fair way, we also have to think of cooling, clean cooking, and other factors, not just renewable energy that women can benefit from, that are more palpable to their, to the type of routines that they have. So I just wanted to maybe bring the fact that we still have a massive gap, and I think it's about, forgot the number, but for all the money we need for clean cooking, about 3% is being really channeled where it has to be. So I think this is a huge push that we need from all sectors.
Tish? Yeah.
So I have to follow you. Because the bar really high. This is a very diverse panel, and I think that we're all coming at the same issue, maybe from different directions. And so what sort of comes to me from this discussion, which is a really good one, is that it actually takes everyone. It can't just be the government, or it takes everyone. And so I think we all have to work together to solve this issue. So I'm going to pass it over to you.
I think when I was looking over some of my notes, 2 things that strike me, and I'm just going to leave it out there. Evidently, according to The Economist, men in rich countries care less about a warming planet. Ouch. And women are better stewards of the environment, which I think probably could have guessed, but HBR put out a whole study on this and how they have better attention to looking at climate change. So again, kind of shows again, I guess, trying to look at this from an opportunistic potentially positive way of where people are already smart enough to self-identify with a trend that is going to affect all of us dramatically. And let's foster that. Let's continue to figure out a way, I think, at the entrepreneurial level. I'm always astounded when I have a chance to go and see that tip of the spear part of our programming at Power Africa and see these entrepreneurial ideas coming out. We were just on the West Coast there's a Lincoln Lab, I forget that one accelerator loop, I think it's called, where they had a contest. And there was this Nigerian woman that came out, a student not too long ago, I don't remember how long she was out of school. These fantastic ideas, and there was example after example after example of someone absolutely bucking the trends, figuring out really cool ideas. I mean, just amazing technology. And I think we have to continue to foster that as well. So not only is it the policy stuff, not only is it the better uniforms, as I mentioned, or anything on a spectrum, it's also, again, opportunity, and to some extent, letting the opportunity build itself, because we can't micromanage this completely. We have to open up the space, and that's kind of our responsibility, those of us who have the ability to speak to foreign leaders or manage a program and have the awesome responsibility to try to go after these big goals. But we also make sure that everywhere, I think in every step along the way, the space is open for it to be surprised, and to let that not be threatened by that, and to let it continue to move forward.
And building on what you said, I was sitting in a meeting this morning of the Women Leaders Network, and this is the Africa Euro Foundation is kind of curates this, but it's an amazing group of women talking about climate change, talking about energy transition. The former president of Ireland, Mary Robinson, the former president of Liberia, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, the head of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, just amazing women. And they're dedicating their time, they're coming together, they dedicated 2 hours and they meet regularly, talking about how they can come together to solve these problems. And somebody made the comment, if the women in this room were running the world, we'd be okay.
No argument. I got to meet Mary Robinson when I was in Kigali for your deal. Total fanboy. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm in the same room with you. I'm like, you have sound. And I told her, I'm like, this sounds probably really dopey and whatever. I'm like, you like single-handedly improved our world. I'm like, you as a singular person have improved the world, and you continue to do so. And as they give back. And that was all about the mentoring of women to come back up through those ranks to be the next Mary Robinson.
Yeah,
right?
And that's exactly
So
what
cool.
this is doing.
So
This is really creating that network of women. And one thing they brought up is connecting these women networks and bringing them together to talk about climate change, to work on climate change, to come up with the solutions of climate change and energy transitions, and making sure that all of this power is leveraged amongst all of these groups. All right, I'm going to open it up to questions from you all. So, somebody break the ice. Anyone?
Do I need the mic?
I think we can.
You could just talk, I could just say.
Oh, okay. So something that resonated with me was when you were talking about clean cooking across the world. And it's something that we also see here in New York City, believe it or not. In parts of New York City, there's people who don't know how to make clean smoothies, or they don't know how to eat better foods. And this is something that we've seen a lot in the past couple of years. I've worked with some students who are trying to bring it and make it more accessible. So I want to say, how do you think us as a people can better understand or better help around the world with this issue?
I think it's for you.
Yes,
Maybe you can also propose you can add. I think that's a great point, and I think that I believe a lot in youth engagement and raising awareness to the problem. So even for health and for securing food systems, I think that it's important for young people being taught in schools and bringing that to their families, and being part of other organizations where they can expand that knowledge to the community, because it's interesting, because growing up and going to college when I was doing all my youth-led work in schools and universities, it's so different when you're a young person talking to a young person about something you're passionate about than having someone more senior coming to you and saying you have to learn this. So I think that makes a difference, and I think that the younger that people can be to get together to talk about these issues, the better, no matter what type of issue it is, because they're the only ones that know what really matters to them. And this comes here, to this country that is also very diverse. It's really hard to find one type of solution that serves all communities. So I think that when it comes to anything, energy, health, improving the way that you're eating, and even fostering family agriculture, which is so important, and reducing waste, all of that I think comes, from being engaged in these things, and from schools. I think education is so important because I feel like schools also have a responsibility of teaching that to students and parents from keeping kids in schools. I think education is always the answer for everything, so I wish all women had education. Unfortunately, it's not the reality.
Also add that I think, speaking from the private sector perspective, I think that corporations, to the extent they're in the communities, also have a role to play in terms of continuing to develop those communities. So they should, I would think that they should understand the need, and they should be making those partnerships to provide that education.
All right, thank you. Next question.
I can answer. And it's for the gentleman. So obviously, this is energy is a male-dominated, I would say, environment. What are your experience, and what are things that you've done to bring men into the conversation? I turn around, there are only 4, right? So, including my colleague who's here voluntarily. So how can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure this is an energy-centric answer. I think, though, I guess energy, obviously. Yeah, no, but and I'm sitting there now too. But I'm trying to think. The answer comes more, I think, for general. I think Empower Africa. This is a deeper, larger question, right? How do you bring people to the floor to make sure you have the tough conversations, to make sure that you then get the right norms? How do you coach? Is it, it's a big conversation, right? So I'm proud of what USAID has done, I think, over the last couple of years. I think it's for a government agency in particular, it's a very progressive organization, maybe a bit self-selected in terms of those of us who end up being, it kind of looks very homogenous in terms of outlook to life and perspective, but not always. And there's some tough conversations, and those are the ones where you really can get to work where I think people might think they've arrived, including myself, and then you realize, well, I really have a lot of ways to go. I don't listen well enough. Didn't pick up on that. I didn't see that. So I think, to your point, we try to have conversations around that. We try to create a safe environment. It's not just about gender. It's about a lot of other inclusive and equitable practice. We fall short, I'm absolutely sure, at times, and I try to, as a leader of an organization, say, this is a space I hope I can say to you it's safe. I hope you feel it's safe, and I hope we can bring it up within our ranks, and there will be a floor we will never go beneath, and there's a level of respect that we won't allow, and that will be more of a corrective action, and that's not where you want to be. But let's hope everyone's above the floor, and we're all trying to climb up to the higher ladders, and we just have those conversations where people will be uncomfortable. And so we have a whole set of trainings, for instance, that have been new. We try to organize ourselves after those trainings to say, do we want a smaller group where we can have a more honest conversation? Sometimes those get pretty raw and pretty honest, but I think part of it is exposing people to the conversation. So I guess to make that a little bit energy, put a little energy bow on that, I guess you would go at the areas where you can see the obvious, whether it's in the corporate side, or it's in the government side, or it's on the what we call host government or partner governments side as well, to say, okay, so where do we see the obvious norms? Let's go to the data first. And we got a problem here. We got 32% going back to that figure again. Or, people don't feel safe. Or I've heard comments, and then you go and you try to dive around it. I don't know if that's a decent answer.
All right. Thank you, Mark, Tish, Eduarda. Great panel, great conversation. Thanks everyone for being part of it, and just keep working on the just and equitable energy transition so that all women can benefit as we progress towards this ultimate goal. All right. Thank you.